Hi, I'm 62 years old, and tomorrow morning I have an interview for a junior estimating position at a mid-sized commercial firm. 30 years of managing multi-million-dollar construction projects, of being the guy who approved the budgets and called the shots, and now I'm just praying the hiring manager overlooks the deep lines on my face so I can afford the heating bill in this cramped, rented apartment in Chicago. $175,000. That's the exact price of my arrogance. My retirement security, the cash I bled for over decades of rigid routines, evaporated into the humid air of a city 5,000 miles away. People assume you lose that kind of money because you're stupid, or maybe because you're greedy. But it's not stupidity. It's much quieter than that. You lose it because for the first time in years, someone looks at you and makes you feel like you aren't invisible anymore. You lose it because the sudden deafening silence of an empty house terrifies you, and you are desperate enough to buy the illusion that you still matter. I didn't stumble into this ruin. I walked into it with my eyes wide open. I engineered every single rationalization myself, signed the wire transfers, and handed over the keys to my own life. I can trace the collapse back to a sudden Tuesday afternoon rainstorm, a plastic table at a beachside kiosk, and the exact moment I decided to ignore the one principle I spent my entire career relying on. When a foundation shows cracks, you don't build on it. For 32 years, my life was measured in concrete curing times, structural load capacities, and variance reports. I was a civil engineer and a senior project manager for one of the largest commercial development firms in the Midwest. If a subcontractor tried to hide a fractured load-bearing beam behind a layer of fresh drywall, I caught it. If a supplier tried to inflate a materials invoice by 3%, I caught it. My entire professional existence was built on anticipating structural failure before it happened. I evaluated risk for a living. I didn't gamble. I planned. I built a good, solid life, the kind you're supposed to build. I was married to Helen for 28 years. We raised 2 kids, paid for their college, and watched them move away to start their own families in Denver and Seattle. When Helen was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, I approached it the only way I knew how. I managed her care with the same rigid, unforgiving efficiency I applied to a job site. I built spreadsheets for her medications, optimized her appointment schedules, and organized the medical bills. I was the provider. I was the pillar. Then she passed away. The logistics stopped, and the silence moved in. People don't talk about the physical weight of an empty house. It actually presses down on you. I retired a few months after I turned 62. I had my pension, about $450,000 in liquid savings, and a house that suddenly felt like a museum of a life that was already over. Without a crew to manage or a wife to care for, I started noticing how the world interacted with me, or rather, how it stopped. I was no longer the boss. I wasn't the head of a busy household. To the cashiers, the neighbors, and the people on the street, I had become just another gray-haired widower in a fleece jacket buying single portions of chicken breast at the grocery store. I was invisible. I was terrified of simply waiting out the clock, watching my life slowly power down. So, I made a decision. I told my kids I was renting out the Chicago house and relocating to Rio de Janeiro on a long-term tourist visa. I didn't frame it as a desperate bid to feel alive again. I framed it naturally as a spreadsheet. I told them the brutal winters were finally wrecking my arthritis, which was a convenient half-truth. I explained the favorable exchange rate, the drastically lower cost of living, and how it was a shrewd, practical strategy to maximize my retirement fund. It sounded logical. I was always logical. I convinced them, and more importantly, I convinced myself. I rented a comfortable, unpretentious apartment in Copacabana. I wasn't there to be a wealthy tourist throwing money around. I was there to reboot, and for the first few months, the system operated exactly as I had engineered it. I lived frugally. I woke up early, drank strong local coffee, studied Portuguese vocabulary from a paperback workbook, and read historical biographies on the beach. The weather was perfect. The city was vibrant. I had successfully changed my geography. But the truth was, you can change the climate, but you can't outrun the quiet. I was still waking up every morning with absolutely no one relying on me. No one needing my advice, my protection, or my presence. The backdrop was tropical, but the void was exactly the same. My apartment was on the 7th floor, 3 blocks back from the beach on a noisy, tree-lined street called Rua Domingos Ferreira. I chose it intentionally. Paying the premium for a direct ocean view didn't make mathematical sense. I had built a comprehensive spreadsheet before I even booked my flight, factoring in historical exchange rates, inflation indices, and conservative returns on my $450,000 in liquid savings. According to my projections, living slightly inland allowed me to stretch my capital comfortably into my 90s. It was a solid, bulletproof plan. I treated my retirement like a job site. I needed a schedule, so I engineered one. I woke up at exactly 6 a.m. every day. I made black coffee and sat at a small, wobbly glass dining table with a Portuguese grammar workbook, diligently memorizing verb conjugations. By 8:30 a.m., I was out on the mosaic sidewalks, letting the heavy, salty humidity loosen the stiffness in my knees. I would buy a single pão de queijo from a corner bakery for exactly 6 reais, speaking in broken but rehearsed Portuguese. I was quietly proud of these small efficiencies. I wasn't some naive tourist getting taken for a ride on the beachfront. I was a pragmatist executing a well-researched strategy. I was in control. But by early afternoon, the structural integrity of my day would inevitably begin to sag. There is a hard limit to how many historical biographies you can read sitting in a rented beach chair. There are only so many times you can walk the length of Copacabana before the scenery becomes just another backdrop. I would sit there, watching the city breathe and move around me. Groups of teenagers playing foot volley, young couples arguing and making up, grandfathers holding the hands of toddlers in the surf. Every single person out there was tethered to someone else. They were part of a web of obligations, arguments, and affections. I was entirely unmoored. In Chicago, even on my worst days, I was Arthur Pendleton, the senior project manager, the husband, the father. I was the man who could solve a critical supply chain crisis with 3 phone calls, the man who knew exactly which hospital corridor to navigate to get my wife her treatments. I had authority. I had a function. Here, in this vibrant, chaotic paradise, I was harmless. I was invisible, a polite, gray-haired ghost in linen shirts. I began to realize that the most terrifying part of outliving your responsibilities is the sudden absence of friction. I missed the weight of being needed. I missed having a problem to solve, a person to protect, a crisis to manage. A man who has spent 40 years acting as the load-bearing pillar for his family and his company doesn't just shut off that instinct because he changes latitudes. The urge to provide, to be the capable savior, was still hardwired into my system. I just didn't have anywhere to put it. I told my kids on our scheduled Sunday video calls that I was having the time of my life, embracing this late-life adventure. I smiled, showed them the view from my window, and lied. I refused to admit how deafening the silence of that apartment was when the sun went down. I know now that a man is never more vulnerable than when he convinces himself he is perfectly fine. I had built a fortress of logic and financial planning around myself, completely blind to the fact that the foundation was already hollowed out by loneliness. I was an empty building, structurally sound on the outside, just waiting for someone to walk in and claim the space. And that is exactly where my head was when the sky suddenly turned the color of bruised iron and the rain began to pour that Tuesday afternoon in Lemmy. The rain didn't start as a drizzle. In Rio, the sky just bruises purple and suddenly drops the ocean on your head. It was a Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting at a small plastic table at a kiosk in Lemmy, the quieter end of the beach, finishing a bottle of sparkling water. When the downpour hit, the few people on the sand scrambled for cover under the kiosk's canvas awning. That was when she sat down across from me. She didn't ask, just offered a quick, breathless smile as she pulled out the plastic chair, shaking the heavy rain from her dark hair. She was young, 31, I'd learn later, but she didn't have the manufactured, polished look you see on the tourist strips. She wore simple linen pants, a plain white tank top, and carried a leather tote bag that looked genuinely worn. "Sorry," she said, her English surprisingly sharp, carrying only a soft cadence of an accent. "It's either this or I ruin my laptop." Her name was Mariana. She told me she was an event producer, caught between a site visit and a client meeting when the weather broke. I braced myself for the usual transactional small talk. I was used to the dynamic by then, the polite questions, the subtle calculation of my watch, my shoes, the inevitable pivot to suggesting an expensive restaurant or a tour I should pay for. But that pivot never came. When the waiter rushed over, I instinctively gestured to cover whatever she wanted. She stopped me, holding up a hand. She ordered a coconut water and explicitly handed the man her own debit card. "I appreciate it, Arthur," she said, catching my eye, "but I pay my own bills. Too many girls around here looking for foreign sugar daddies. It's embarrassing." It was exactly what I needed to hear. It immediately disarmed the cynical alarms I had spent 40 years fine-tuning. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way she looked at me. When I mentioned, almost in passing, my career in civil engineering, her eyes didn't glaze over. She asked about load distributions. She asked about the logistics of managing a crew of 200 men. She asked questions that required me to be the expert, the authority. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't an aging widower. I was an interesting man with a formidable mind. The rain stopped, but she stayed for another hour. The progression of our connection felt entirely organic, dictated by her apparent simplicity. We didn't go to upscale steakhouses or rooftop bars. We walked. She took me to the quiet, winding streets of Urca, where the city felt like a small village frozen in the 70s. We spent an afternoon wandering through Santa Teresa, looking at decaying colonial architecture while she asked my opinion on the structural integrity of the old retaining walls. She made me feel like a mentor, a protector. Instead of letting me take her out for dinner, she insisted on coming to my apartment to cook. She would arrive with grocery bags full of black beans, farofa, and cheap cuts of meat, commandeering my small kitchen with an effortless domesticity. She chopped garlic while I sat at the glass table, drinking wine and talking. I told her about Helen. I told her about the cancer, the spreadsheets, the final months. I expected her to pull away, to find the grief of an old man heavy and unappealing. Instead, she turned the stove off, sat across from me, and listened with an intense, quiet empathy. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just held my hand across the table and told me I was a good man. I introduced her to my routine, and she seamlessly wove herself into it. She brought around a couple of young men she introduced as her cousins, polite, deferential kids who called me Sir and listened to my stories with genuine awe. I was building a family again. I was at the head of the table. Of course, the signs were there. They always are. I noticed her phone was constantly buzzing. Whenever a message lit up the screen, she would quickly swipe it away or flip the phone face down. If I glanced over, she'd let out a tired sigh and complain about a demanding client or a vendor trying to renegotiate a contract. It seemed plausible. She was a modern, independent woman running a stressful business. I told myself that questioning it would make me look like an insecure, controlling old man. I was Arthur Pendleton. I didn't need to check up on people. Then came the first request. Just $300. a bureaucratic fee for an event permit that had caught her off guard on a bank holiday. She was frantic, embarrassed, practically in tears when she asked. I wired the money without blinking. It wasn't a handout. It was a bridge loan for a capable professional. And exactly on Friday, just as she promised, she handed me the cash in an envelope. I felt a surge of validation. She was honorable. I had evaluated the risk, and my judgment was sound. I was in complete control. When a physical structure is failing, it rarely snaps all at once. It groans, it shifts, it gives you micro-fractures and hairline cracks long before the catastrophic collapse. But if you are determined to build on that foundation, you don't look for the cracks. You look for reasons to ignore them. By the third month, Mariana had practically moved into the Copacabana apartment. It wasn't a formal arrangement, but her leather tote bag never seemed to leave the chair by the door, and the bathroom shelf slowly filled with her expensive creams and serums. The oppressive silence that used to greet me every morning was gone. Instead, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of her humming in the shower. I felt a surge of vitality I hadn't experienced in a decade. I wasn't just a retired widower killing time anymore. I was part of a dynamic, living equation. I was needed. Because the initial $300 loan had been returned to me exactly on time, in a neat white envelope, my internal risk assessment alarms were completely deactivated. That single engineered act of reliability became the precedent I used to justify everything that followed. The requests began to scale, but they never felt like begging. They were always framed as temporary cash flow issues for her event production business. A vendor who needed a cash deposit for a lighting rig, a caterer who didn't take credit cards. $200 here, $500 there. I didn't just hand the money over blindly. I asked questions. I made her explain the logistics of her events. I played the role of the seasoned executive mentoring the ambitious young entrepreneur, and she played the grateful protégé perfectly. She made me feel like my 30 years of corporate experience were exactly what she had been missing to succeed. Then came the $15,000 pitch. She didn't ask for it over dinner. She sat me down at the glass dining table on a Thursday morning, opened her laptop, and walked me through a business plan for a new boutique event company she wanted to launch. She had spreadsheets. She had projected profit margins. She showed me how the seed capital would guarantee us a steady, passive income stream within 6 months. I looked at the numbers. I knew, logically, that investing in a foreign startup with no legal oversight was reckless. But I didn't see myself as a mark. I saw myself as an angel investor, a partner, the essential financial pillar holding up her dreams. I wired the $15,000 from my brokerage account that afternoon. When the transfer cleared, she cried, hugged me tightly, and whispered that no one in her entire life had ever believed in her the way I did. It was an intoxicating drug, and I bought it outright. To protect that high, I had to systematically dismantle reality. Her phone was a constant source of friction. It buzzed incessantly on the table during dinners, lighting up with messages she would quickly swipe away or hide by placing the device face down. When I finally asked about it, she let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing her temples. She blamed highly demanding clients, aggressive vendors, and the relentless stress of being a young woman running a business in Rio. It was a plausible defense. I told myself that questioning her further would make me look like exactly what I was terrified of being, a controlling, insecure, jealous old man. I was Arthur Pendleton. I managed multi-million-dollar sites. I didn't check up on people's phones. I was in control. But the isolation was happening, and it was entirely by design. Before Mariana, I had started attending a weekly meetup with a few other American and British retirees at a pub in Ipanema. It was nothing special, just a few guys drinking imported beer and complaining about the bureaucracy, but it was human contact. Mariana slowly put an end to it. She pointed out that I always ended up paying for more than my fair share of the tab. She told me they were taking advantage of my generosity, that they didn't respect me, and more importantly, that they looked at her with judgment. She made it an issue of loyalty, us against them. I stopped going. She did the same with my family. My Sunday afternoon video calls with my children in Denver and Seattle had been the anchor of my week. Suddenly, Mariana started booking romantic weekend getaways to small coastal towns like Paraty or Buzios right over those weekends. "The Wi-Fi here is terrible, Arthur," she would say, pouring me a glass of wine on a hotel balcony. "Just text them. You can call them on Tuesday. This is our time." I wanted it to be our time. I wanted the illusion so badly that I actively helped her isolate me from anyone who might puncture it. The most glaring warning didn't come from my family, though. It came from the night doorman at my building, a tired man in his 50s named Roberto. One evening, after I had walked Mariana to her Uber, I stopped in the lobby to check the mail. Roberto stepped out of his booth. He looked around nervously before leaning over the marble counter. "Mr. Arthur," he said, his English thick and broken. "Be careful. She come here many times last year with another gringo. An older man, German, I think." I felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. For exactly 3 seconds, the entire architectural blueprint of my life in Rio threatened to collapse. But then the ego kicked in. The defense mechanisms I had spent 40 years building snapped into place. I looked at Roberto's worn uniform and his tired eyes. I processed his warning not as a statement of fact, but through a filter of arrogance. I convinced myself he was either gossiping, prejudiced against the 30-year age gap between us, or perhaps laying the groundwork to ask for a bribe to keep quiet about my personal life. He didn't know her character. He didn't see the business plans or the late-night conversations. He was just a doorman. I was a senior project manager. I knew how to read people. "Thank you, Roberto, but I'm perfectly fine," I said, my voice cold and authoritative. I walked into the elevator, pressed the button for the 7th floor, and effectively sealed my own fate. I had evaluated the risk, dismissed the data, and decided to keep building on the fault line. I had always been a builder. You don't rent a foundation, you pour it yourself. Copacabana was fine for a tourist, but it was transient, chaotic, and loud. If I was going to anchor the rest of my life in this country, I needed a permanent structure. Mariana planted the seed so delicately, I was entirely convinced I had grown it myself. She started pointing out real estate listings on her phone over breakfast. Not for her, she insisted, but just showing me what the market was doing in Barra da Tijuca, a modern, expanding neighborhood down the coast, full of secure high-rises and pristine avenues. It was exactly the kind of planned, orderly environment that appealed to my engineering mind. We started casually touring open houses on Sunday afternoons, treating it like a harmless hobby. Then we walked into a sunlit 10th-floor apartment with a sprawling balcony overlooking the Atlantic. It was empty, echoing, and immaculate. The asking price was exactly $150,000. In Chicago, that money bought a decaying one-bedroom in a secondary suburb. Here, it bought a penthouse lifestyle. It bought a future. Standing on that balcony, feeling the ocean breeze and watching Mariana map out where a dining table would go, I made the decision. I was going to buy it, not as an investment for my portfolio, but to secure our life together. The trap, when it finally sprang, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic misdirection. When I told Mariana I was ready to make an offer, she didn't jump with joy. Instead, she looked deeply worried. She sat me down and walked me through the brutal reality of Brazilian property law for foreign buyers. She explained the mandatory central bank registrations, the exorbitant foreign capital taxes, the endless notarizations, and the very real possibility that the deal would be tied up in red tape for months, during which we would lose the apartment to a local cash buyer. I knew she wasn't entirely lying. I had read the expat forums. The bureaucracy here was notoriously suffocating. Then she offered the solution, It was simple, elegant, and perfectly logical. We would put the deed entirely in her name. She was a Brazilian citizen. The transaction would close in a matter of days, completely bypassing the international tax penalties and the legal friction. "Arthur, it's just a piece of paper for the government," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "Once my divorce is fully finalized next year and we can officially get married, it automatically becomes a marital asset anyway. It's just to save us the headache right now." To a man who had spent 30 years optimizing supply chains and eliminating inefficiencies, this didn't look like a scam. It looked like a brilliant workaround. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem. But beneath the cold, calculated logic, my ego was screaming for the chance to make the ultimate gesture. I wanted to prove to her, and, more desperately to myself, that I wasn't just another cynical, stingy old man guarding his retirement fund. I was her partner. I was the capable provider. I trusted her implicitly, and I wanted her to know it. The next morning, I sat alone at my wobbly glass table in Copacabana, logged into my Vanguard brokerage account, and authorized the liquidation of $150,000. It took 3 clicks of a mouse, 30 years of early mornings, missed family dinners, and rigid budgeting vaporized into a digital wire transfer across the equator. Watching the confirmation screen load, I didn't feel a single ounce of fear. I felt powerful. If you want to keep a mark on the hook, you don't disappear the moment the check clears. You give them exactly what they paid for, just long enough for the concrete to set. The validation I received in the days following the transfer was absolute. Mariana was overwhelmingly affectionate. The mysterious, stressful texts on her phone seemed to vanish. We spent an entire week in a haze of domestic bliss, walking through high-end showrooms in Barra, picking out a heavy oak dining table and a massive modular sofa. She deferred to my taste on everything, asking my opinion on fabric durability and spatial layout. I was designing our life. The pinnacle of the illusion arrived on a Friday night. The apartment was still completely empty, smelling of fresh paint and floor wax. Mariana organized an intimate dinner right there on the bare hardwood. She brought takeout from a high-end churrascaria, and a few hours later, her brother and 2 of her cousins arrived carrying expensive champagne. We sat in a circle on the floor, eating, laughing, and looking out at the city lights reflecting off the ocean. The air was thick with celebration. At the end of the meal, her brother, a tall, serious-looking man in his 30s, poured the last of the champagne into our plastic cups. He stood up, looked me dead in the eye, and raised his glass. He didn't speak English, but Mariana translated for him, her eyes shining with tears. "He says thank you," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "He says he has never seen me this safe. He wants to toast to you, Arthur. O homem da familia, the man of the family." I raised my plastic cup and drank. I looked around that bright, echoing room, surrounded by people who respected me, sitting next to a beautiful woman who needed me. I felt a profound, intoxicating sense of triumph. I had beaten the system. I had outsmarted aging. I had engineered my way entirely out of the dark. 3 weeks. That's exactly how long the concrete needed to set. 3 weeks after I signed the wire transfer, Mariana packed a small carry-on bag. She kissed me at the door of the Copacabana apartment, told me she had a vital, multi-day event production conference in São Paulo, and promised to call me from the hotel. I didn't panic when she didn't call that first night. I was a rational man. Flights get delayed, conferences run long, people get exhausted. But the next day, my calls went straight to voicemail. My texts were met with hours of silence, eventually followed by brief, sterile replies. "In a meeting. Bad reception. Call tomorrow." By the 3rd day, the silence wasn't just heavy, it was absolute. I told myself I was just being a worried partner. I convinced myself there might have been a logistical problem with the furniture delivery at the new place in Barra da Tijuca, and she was just overwhelmed. So I took a taxi down the coast. I walked into the lobby of the building I had paid for, nodded to the concierge, and took the elevator to the 10th floor. I put my key into the heavy brass lock of the front door. It didn't turn. I pulled it out, checked the teeth, and pushed it back in. It jammed halfway. I knocked. No answer. I knocked harder, the sound echoing down the pristine, empty hallway. When I finally went back down to the lobby, my heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I asked the building manager, a polite man in a crisp grey suit, to check on the unit. He looked at his registry, then looked back at me with a mixture of confusion and quiet pity. "Mr. Pendleton," he said gently, tapping his screen. "Donna Mariana changed the locks on Tuesday. The unit is occupied. She signed a 2-year lease with a corporate tenant. They moved in yesterday. There is no dramatic explosion when your life collapses. There is only a sickening, localized vacuum where your future used to be." I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I walked out of the air-conditioned lobby and into the suffocating midday heat. I sat on a concrete bench facing the Atlantic Ocean and let the mathematics of my ruin wash over me. $150,000 for the apartment, at least $25,000 more in bridge loans, startup investments, and living expenses. $175,000 gone. But the money was just the math. The real devastation was the sudden, brutal clarity. The man who managed multi-million-dollar projects, the man who caught contractors lying about material stress loads, hadn't been outsmarted by a sophisticated criminal syndicate. I had been dismantled by a 31-year-old woman who realized that if you look at an invisible aging man and tell him he is strong, he will hand you the keys to his own vault. I was never her partner. I was never a savior or a mentor or the man of the family. I was a mark, an easy, predictable, arrogant mark. I packed my bags in the Copacabana apartment 2 days later. The heavy oak table, the massive modular sofa, the life I thought I was designing. It was all just staging for an open house I was funding. I couldn't go to the local police. I had voluntarily wired the money, explicitly bypassed the legal protections, and put the asset entirely in her name. The trap was perfectly legal because I had engineered it myself. And I couldn't tell my children. The shame was too dense, too crushing. How do you explain to your son that the bulletproof father he relies on traded his retirement security for the illusion that a beautiful young woman found him fascinating? So, I flew back to the United States. I rented this cramped apartment. And tomorrow morning, at 62 years old, I will put on a suit that feels a little too big for me, sit across from a hiring manager half my age, and beg for a junior estimating position just to keep the heat on. People want to believe that victims of these things are stupid. It makes them feel safe. But it isn't stupidity. It's the terrifying realization that your logic is completely useless when your foundation is hollow. I didn't lose my life savings because I didn't understand the risks. I lost it because I couldn't bear the quiet of my own life anymore. I bought the lie at exactly the asking price, simply because my ego and my fear of dying alone demanded it to be true. And the cruelest part of it all? As I sit here, listening to the winter wind rattle the cheap windows of this apartment, the silence is louder than it ever was before.